Welcome to the AtlantECO podcast, where we talk about the science behind the AtlantECO project, the Atlantic Ocean, and the human adventures experienced along the way. Here, we have conversations with guests from around the world who work together so that we can better understand, manage, and protect the ocean. So let's embark on the journey of AtlantECO and discover the world that lies above and beneath the surface of the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. In today's episode of the AtlantECO podcast, we have the pleasure to talking about the ocean's dynamic nature and the connectivity between the different regions of the ocean with our guest, Erik van Sebille. Hi, Erik.
Hi, Eloise.
Erik, before you tell us more about seascapes and the ocean dynamics, can you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how did you come to do what you do today?
Yeah, I am a physicist by training. I am now what's called a professor of oceanography and public engagement. But I started as a physics student because essentially I wanted to become the weatherman on television. I was mesmerized and super interested in weather and prediction and understanding everything that happened around me as a young kid, right? And so I studied a few physics, fluid dynamics, took classes on meteorology and also on oceanography. And I still remember very well that the first time ever that I went to sea on an expedition, a scientific expedition, I was in my fourth year of my studies with my master program. I went out from the Canary Islands for 6 weeks on an expedition to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, essentially in the middle of what AtlantECO is studying. And it was so fantastic. It was so beautiful to be on that ship, working all day on trying to understand how the ocean works and what the ocean does and how the ocean is important in our global climate. And it was really on that ship that I realized, well, I want to become an oceanographer. I want to work on this. I want to understand the ocean's role in climate and in ecosystems. So I continued my studies, did a PhD, worked a bit all across the world. That's a good thing, I guess, of being an oceanographer. I'm from the Netherlands, and after doing my PhD here in the Netherlands, I spent 2 years in Miami, then 4 years in Sydney, then another 2 years in London before returning to Utrecht in the Netherlands, where I'm now a professor.
That sounds amazing, really inspiring. I guess once you get on the boat, you just fall in love with the sea and everything that's in it.
Absolutely. It is so beautiful. And you know what my favorite routine is? And since that first cruise, I've done many other expeditions and always did I have the same routine. Is that I set my alarm quite early in the morning. I wake up, I take a cup of coffee, and I go to the deck and I just watch the sea for 15 or 20 minutes, all by myself. The weather that day, the birds around the ship, the ocean state. Interesting that you see the time zone shifts as the ship travels east or west, and really be one with nature. And just that 15 minutes of time with me, my coffee, and the ocean. Yeah, that is so inspiring. That is so relaxing. That is beautiful.
Yeah, I'm lucky enough also to have the sea just, I can see it from the window as well. And it is such it sets your mood for the day, doesn't it? It's just such a beautiful thing to see every day.
It does, absolutely. Although I don't like swimming so much.
Oh, right. You're an oceanographer that doesn't swim.
No, well, I'm happy to be on the ocean. I'm just not really particularly interested to be in it.
Brilliant. And Erik, can you tell us, how did you get involved in the AtlantECO project?
Well, it started at a conference when I met some of the other key people in AtlantECO, especially Daniela. And we started chatting about, well, how fantastic it would be if we would really combine physics and biology into one project, because they can really learn from each other. The physicists can learn from the biologists, and the biologists can learn from the physicists. And really, only in a multidisciplinary project can we come up with a better understanding of how the Atlantic ecosystem works. So yeah, it started over beer, like most good things in life.
Well, we're here today to talk about Seascape and about connectivity. So, what are these things? Can you explain to us what these are and why it is so important to study them?
Exactly. So I think that the main point is that the sea and the ocean is not a bathtub. It's not just a body of water that sits there and it does nothing. It is not a blank slate on which organisms move around. In fact, the ocean itself moves around. It is in constant motion. It is constantly moving around, and it's very turbulent. And all of that movement of the water itself, that is the seascape. Especially if you then also add that the ocean is not the same everywhere, right? It's warmer near the tropics, it's colder near the poles, it has different salinities, it has different amounts of oxygen if you go deeper into the ocean. The nutrients also vary. So all of this changes around. But because the ocean is in constant motion and moves, that everything that lives in the ocean, from the largest whales to the smallest bacteria, are in some ways at the mercy of these currents, right? Some fish can swim, of course, and they can somewhat control where they are. But even they, if they wouldn't be doing anything, they would be moving around with the currents. But especially what we study in AtlantECO, the tinier organisms, the plankton that can't swim for themselves, where they are is completely determined by the currents. And also, therefore, what temperatures they experience. They have to be adapted to constantly changing temperature as the currents move them from A to B. It is really quite different in the ocean from on land, right? Most land organisms, and especially the trees and the plants, they are just in one location. And sure, they have seasonal variability in the temperature, but they don't have this dynamic movement around. So I like to compare the seascape to kind of like the stage, right? So if you go to a play and if the stage is fixed, well, then that could be an interesting play. That's what ecology on land is like. But in the ocean, the stage is moving around too. It's as if so sometimes you have these fantastic plays with rotating stages. That is kind of what the ocean seascape is.
That's really interesting and makes it even more challenging to study, I guess, if everything is moving everywhere all the time.
Exactly. And what we want to understand is what the patterns are of that movement and the drivers are of that movement, because it's not random. It's not as if organisms or plankton move randomly from A to B. There is some predictability in it. We know that there are currents. Think about the Gulf Stream. Think about the Brazil current or the North Brazil current or the Agulhas rings that form south of Africa and then move all the way across the Atlantic until they hit the Brazilian continent. All of these currents we know, but we don't really know how they are connected. And we also don't really know how they vary in time. Oceanographers have for decades really liked to draw currents as arrows, right? And very often if you open an atlas, then you can see that there are currents and they're mapped on an atlas. But it's almost as if it is kind of like a network of highways, as if there's always a flow from one location to the other location. Now, what we have realized, and it's really only over the past 20 years or so, is that actually there's much more variability to that. Those networks is not the same all the time. It varies, and it varies because of what we call eddies. Eddies are kind of like small whirlpools in the ocean that add turbulence to all these pathways. And that is what makes it so interesting. The large-scale currents and the small-scale eddies and how they impact on each other. That is what we want to find out in AtlantECO.
And so how is this studied? How do we study all these things moving around?
Yeah, of course, you want to track things in the ocean, right? So the archetypical image that you would have is rubber duckies, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic if we have rubber duckies that flow with the flow? And I have actually my office here is full of rubber duckies. But of course, so rubber duckies are not ideal scientific instruments because we can't track them. So what actually are better and what scientists have been developed and which we've also used in AtlantECO are drifters. Drifters that are a bit like the rubber duckies, but they have a GPS, they have a satellite communication device, and we can track them in real time as they are moved with the currents. Now, the big problem, though, with drifters is that they really only work at the surface of the ocean. At the surface of the ocean, they can make contact with the satellites and we can track them. But but we can't really do that at depth because all the water prevents the satellite signals to penetrate far enough. So at depth, it's much harder to actually track the flows. And then what we do is that we go to simulations, to numerical models. And in AtlantECO, we have a lot of people that work on very sophisticated, state-of-the-art numerical simulations of how the Atlantic Ocean is moving, right? It's a bit like what the weather forecasters are doing. They are simulating the winds and the clouds and everything, while we are simulating the winds of the ocean, the currents, at super high resolution to understand what is happening down there. So what's especially interesting about AtlantECO is that we then check how good our simulations are by looking at what they mean to the movement of plankton. So we use the biology to say something about the physics and to assess the quality of the physics that we have. And that, I think, is really novel, interesting, and super multidisciplinary. We couldn't ever do this if it wasn't for projects like AtlantECO, where biologists and physicists like me are collaborating so intensely that we can really learn from each other. And in the particular case of the simulations, we make a simulation of the ocean currents. We put in virtual plankton. We track those virtual plankton around and we assess how genetically different they are in the virtual world. And then we compare that to the genetic diversity of these real plankton from the real ocean. And if the two agree, then we have a pretty good hunch that the models are doing what they are expecting to do, because they simulate the same kind of ecology, the same kind of biological effects. And that is what we are after.
That is really interesting, and I guess once you've validated those models, these are going to be put to good use. But who's going to use those models, and what are they going to be used for?
Yeah, exactly. The models are very important because the models can underpin all decision making on how to best manage the Atlantic Ocean. Right? Again, because the Atlantic Ocean is in constant movement, because we have this complex seascape, whatever you do, whatever decisions are made in terms of management, in terms of economic activity in one place, impacts downstream other places, right? So, for example, if one organization decides to put in aquaculture farms somewhere on the east coast of the US, then that through the Gulf Stream may have an impact on much larger areas of the Atlantic Ocean. And the same is true for other parts. If seagrass is grown off the coast of Namibia, for example, in the Benguela, then that seagrass may impact further downstream and maybe almost towards the Brazilian coast. It may drift towards the Brazilian coast. So knowing these kind of things, knowing this connectivity helps managers and planners and politicians in the end to come up with a better strategy of securing the future of the Atlantic Ocean and the ecosystems that thrive in it.
So it's like understanding what the impact might be even before you start something. So
exactly, and then think before you act. that is hopefully what we can help society do.
That is brilliant. So interesting, Erik. Thank you so much for sharing all that insight with us. And I'm sure that we will be back later on in the project to learn more about, what have we found out? What are the currents like in the Atlantic? And how have we actually managed to validate the models?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Erik. And I hope that everybody also on the podcast has enjoyed the insight into what Seascape and what connectivity in the ocean means. And we hope to have you back soon on the podcast. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and look forward to seeing you next time. You can follow the AtlantECO project on our website on www.atlanteco.eu, and you can also find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. All the links and information on the project and on today's episode is in the show notes.